Hello folks, so we've had the new patch for a few weeks now, Rage been falling over as expected, and for me at least it's been a blast. Other than that, we've seen the introduction of the Titan Rune Beta Difficulty for Heroics. This is an expansion upon the Titan Rune system that was introduced with the Old WoW patch, which you might know as Heroic Plus. Needless to say, there were decidedly mixed feelings on the subject when it was announced, but from my perspective I think the idea has always been sound, so long as it wasn't a complete rip-off of Mythic Plus and turned into a timed event, which thank the gods it hasn't. Problem is, Titan Rune Alpha was a bit of a wet fart, as a lot of dungeons were just needlessly annoying and the rewards weren't really worthwhile. However, I can't help but sing the praises of Beta at the minute because they've taken the somewhat uncomfortable foundation of Alpha and made a dungeon mode I've been living in for the best part of the last month. So, for those of you that are unaware, what Blizzard have done is they've taken the mechanics, or the affixes that were placed into each dungeon group in Titan Rune Alpha, and modified them into a system that generally rewards player agency. Now, some are more interesting than others, as is the way with anything. But on the whole, I no longer want to throw myself into a wood chipper if someone suggests running certain heroics. What we're going to do is just go over each of those dungeon groups one by one instead of individual dungeons, as affixes are shared across multiple instances, and also touch on how they feel to run. Now, there will be a degree of subjectiveness here because what I find fun, you may not, and that's fine. But I think it's fair to say nearly every dungeon has been improved somewhat with these changes. First up then, Gundrak and Drak Tharon Keep. Now, not gonna lie, these dungeons were a complete arseache in Alpha. The empowerment was called Blood Rune and increased mob damage by 30% and mob health by 100%. That's pretty much water off a duck's back. But then you had Blood of the Lower. This was a slightly reworked version of the Mythic Plus affix Sanguine. Now, rather than the puddles appearing after a mob dies, they can spawn at any point during combat, and mobs in them need to be moved out quickly. And instead of healing enemies and dealing damage to players for set percentages, it allows mobs stood in them to heal for 100% of the damage they do, meaning they can jump back to full HP in the blink of an eye if you're not careful. Even if you were careful, sometimes the mobs just wouldn't move when you wanted. Perhaps you were rooted or stunned or something to that effect, and there would be nothing you could do to stop them from healing back up, which is a bit of a bugger. On to Beta then. The mob damage goes up to a 40% increase and health by 180%. We also still get the blood patches. However, there are now some strategically placed poison cauldrons which you can click on to get a debuff called Witch Doctor's Brew. This deals 5% nature damage every 5 seconds, so generally just get the tank to take the debuff and all is well. The question then is, why would you want to voluntarily poison your tanks? Simple. If a poison target stands in the blood puddles, they go from red to green and start dealing damage to the mobs. 1% of the mob's health per second to be precise. This is great because in theory it's then player choice on how you approach the dungeon. Now you don't have to use the cauldron, but if you do, you will be able to turn a mechanical disadvantage into a mechanical advantage, and bosses and packs that might otherwise be able to genuinely stop a group in their tracks purely because of a crappy blood puddle spawn, now don't, and your group's ability to be able to kill a boss and not wipe isn't left up to the RNG of whether or not they move out of the big splodge of red on the floor. This change is very much meant to be a kiss-curse sort of effect. Yes, you will be dealing more damage to the mobs, but your elected poison drinker or drinkers is going to be taking chunks of damage in exchange. Now, this is very much a cool idea, but the damage done to the players isn't really that threatening. I've healed, tanked and DPS'd all of these dungeons across multiple classes and specs, and not once did I feel I was in danger of either dying to or being unable to sustain people with the poison debuff. For example, my paladin is probably the healer I play the most, and Judgment of Light can carry the health loss all on its own. Now, maybe they will expand upon this further in the next round of Titan Rune dungeons, Charlie or Delta or Sigma or whatever the bloody hell they call them, and increase the amount of damage or the frequency it's taken, possibly both. but right now, the effect is definitely leaning towards Kiss more than it is Curse. But regardless, with the change, the flow of the dungeons are much smoother, and without the ever-looming possibility of an unfortunate blood patch screwing up a boss or even a particularly mean pack, it's a much more enjoyable experience for both instances. Then we got ourselves the little gems that are the Halls of Stone and Halls of Lightning. The empowerment for these two was creatively called Titan Rune. Original, I know. But in alpha, it increased mob damage by a measly 5%, but health by 190. The affix here was definitely meant to be a Kiss curse, a stacking debuff you got from the ads called Pulsing Saronite Corrupted Titan Energy. Try saying that 5 times drunk. It would increase damage done by 1% and damage taken by 2%, up to 50 and 100% respectively. Now, if you were a DPS that didn't over-aggro, it was grand, you could just let loose. However, the debuff needed to be managed by your tanks, because if they weren't careful, they'd get bitch-slapped into next Tuesday. The alpha mode was by no means painful, and was one of the more preferable dungeons to do as a Titan Rune, but it just required your tank to be aware of his stacks at all times. So, Titan Rune Beta. Well, it took that concept and kicked the curse element firmly off a cliff. So now, mob damage is increased by 40% and health by 580. Basically, even the most simple of mobs have boss equivalent HP. How do we handle this then? Well, remember that pulsing Titan energy I mentioned? Well, that shit's now been purified apparently, and we get a stacking buff up to 100 stacks. At maximum, we are then blessed with 100% increased damage and altered versions of the Titan Keeper buffs from Yogg-Saron. So, we get ourselves another 40% increased damage and insane mana regen, allowing casters and healers to just keep pumping and pumping and pumping. For these two dungeons, in Titan Rune Beta, you are meant to just keep going. No downtime, no fuss, no strategic pulls. Throw yourself into the nearest pile of mobs and get swinging. This affix rewards that style of play. It's just stupid fun. That is the only comment I've gotten from people who I've grouped with. It's fun. No ifs, no buts, no maybes. The only real thing you need to consider is making sure you'll be able to pull the next pack or the next boss with the buff active, because it's just that powerful. There's also a new mob that continues the Yogg-Saron theme. There are tentacles spread throughout the instances that, when encountered, will give you a sanity countdown like on the big man himself. Unlike in the raid though, it is tied to attacks and not mechanics, so the faster you hit the tentacles, the faster you will run dry on sanity. More often than not, you will find rogues quickly going insane and getting squashed by their fellow player. However, if you stop attacking for a few moments, the sanity should start regenning slowly. The buffs you get play into this as well, because you don't really want to go up against these tentacles' sans buff. They've got a lot of health, and you need to be able to put out enough damage to counter the speed at which you lose your sanity. The flow and feel of these two instances is massively improved because of the affix. If you are slow and methodical, the dungeon will start to drag, so you don't really benefit from taking your time or being overly clever. You benefit from pulling out your Leroy Jenkins card and diving headfirst into the nearest gathering of elites. I honestly can't really fault these two dungeons, other than saying that whereas in Alpha there was a degree of thought and planning required, now there is no challenge to be seen at all. However, it would be a bit obtuse of me to use this as a critique, because I don't think this affix was designed for difficulty's sake. It was designed for pure insane fun, and that was undeniably achieved. Just watching the mental numbers for 5 minutes is great and is something to be enjoyed in an isolated environment like a couple of instances. Next up, we've got the Utgard dungeons. The empowerment here is called Frost Rune. Mob damage is increased by 30% and health by 100%. Also, at random intervals during combat, players may be targeted with a debuff called Glaciate. What this does is cause patches of frost to form on the ground beneath you, and you need to try and kite them around, as standing in said patches deals frost damage while simultaneously increasing the frost damage you take. So if you ignore it, it will quickly become impossible for your healer to handle. It's simple, it's fair, you've just got to keep an eye out for the debuff and shuffle around accordingly. Titan Rune Beta doesn't really change much here. Damage is now increased by 40 and health by 120. Glaciate still does its thing, but now you're also at risk of being hit by a fire blast that will do a hefty amount of damage over time, and it just puts more pressure on your healer. What you do is, if you hit with this, you find a frost patch and jump in as it removes the fire debuff, but you will still need to get back out as the frost patch will still hurt you as well. Basically, these two dungeons have been clearly designed for healers to nurture their hate for everyone else. But other than that, there's not really much else to say for Utgard. The flow and pacing for both is near identical to Titan Rune Alpha. The changes just mean you will now want at least a patch or two of Glaciate up in case someone does get Fire Blast. And it's not bad by any means, just not as innovative or fun as some, but it's definitely better than others. I think you could best describe them as indifference dungeons. You may not actively seek them out unless for a certain item, or the Proto Drake for example, but if it was the daily, you probably wouldn't be disappointed or annoyed in any way. Let's move on to Azul Narub and Karrot. Unfortunately, I would consider these two the only really disappointing dungeons of the lot. The Titan Rune empowerment here is called Shadow Rune. In alpha mode, it increases mob damage by 30% and health by 100. The USP of these two is that during combat, random members of your party can get web wrapped and you'll need to break them out. The webs themselves are basically one shot, but the problem is the frequency you're webbed increases the more mobs that are actively in combat with you. So, pulls need to be thought out a little bit and webs focus down at all times. But if you haven't got a group that's able to swap and hit quickly enough, you will see some deaths. Even if your tank gets webbed, you can lose someone in the mere seconds it takes to break him out again due to the aggro loss. Or at least this was the case, since writing the first draft and recording this section, Blizzard have hotfixed it so that aggro no longer drops from webbed targets. However, the near universally accepted tactic is still for everyone, ranged and healers included, to stack within melee range for quick releases, but even then it can still go tits up. And I don't think it would be a stretch to consider these two the worst that Titan Rune Alpha has to offer. Sadly, Titan Rune Beta has not improved this in any way and has in fact made them a bigger ball ache. It's in fact possible these are the only two dungeons that will make you curse to every known deity if they crop up as the daily. Mob damage is upped by 40% now and health by 120. In addition to being webbed, if you do not free said webbed person, they will now explode after a few seconds. No ifs, ands or buts about it. Kaboom. Thankfully, this explosion only guarantees the webbed guy's death and doesn't do party-wide damage. But whereas you might have gotten away with de-webbing someone after a pack or something similar in alpha, no such luck in beta. Weirdly though, you do get a stacking buff for every second you're webbed, which can increase the output of your next few abilities. So, in theory, you want to be webbed because you'll do more damage and healing, but the risk far outweighs the reward and you don't actually require said increase to your damage and healing to do the dungeon. Now, if you got this buff for killing the webs and freeing people, then I could see it becoming the bonus Blizz probably intend for it to be, but as the old adage goes, you catch more flies with honey, and actually incentivizing people to kill the webs would make the dungeons far more bearable. The devs unfortunately just dropped the ball on this one. The flow of the spider dungeons is the same in both alpha and beta really. In both versions, everyone is going to need to be close to each other at all times. If there is a straggler at the back, the chances of them being webbed and exploding is quite high. And the affix does somewhat limit the amount of mobs you can pull, because if you grab a pack too many, everyone will end up webbed and thus dead. Then we got the Nexus dungeons, and Violet Hold. So the empowerment for these instances is called Arcane Rune, pretty much what you'd expect for mages and blue dragons. The alpha mode for these three consists of, surprise surprise, a damage and health increase, 30% and 100% respectively. The mobs also have a chance to spawn mirror images that, if not handled, can quickly overwhelm a group. Now, they've got next to no health and just do a little arcane missiles type thing. Again, their power comes from numbers, so as long as you stay on top of them, they aren't going to be that much of a bother. However, it is worth noting that they cannot be cleaved or AoE'd, so direct hits are the only way to deal with them. This affix just prevents mass pulling and requires a bit of forethought, and needs people to actively go out and deal with the mirror images that pop up. But suggesting anything less than complete annihilation to most DPS is heretical, and this often causes some problems because folk don't want to swap away from their murder target just to swat away what amounts to an irritating fly buzzing around. Other than that, the dungeons are much the same as their original incarnations. Titan Rune Beta, however, we do get the increase in damage and health seen throughout all the dungeons. In this case, it goes up by 40 and 120%. But it also does what I suggested should have happened with the spider dungeons. Mirror images now buff the group when they're killed. Huzzah! You get a 5% increase to movement, casting, and attack speed per image killed, capping out at 6 stacks and a maximum of 30%. Now, for those unaware, those are heroism numbers. What these dungeons now do is allow you to basically have hero or bloodlust up full time. Killing an image after you've reached the 6 cap limit just refreshes the buff's timer. They also made the mirror images a little bit more threatening in smaller numbers. They did this by diversifying their toolkit a bit instead of just being static missile bots that would eventually overwhelm you if ignored. They also made them visually unique, so it's obvious who's who. You now have one type that can charge and silence your healer and casters if not dealt with ASAP. These chaps are big, red, and angry. Then there's a second that can do decent enough AoE damage if left to its own devices. These ones have paladin wings glued to their backs. And the OG missile bots still remain, but are frankly now the weakest of the bunch. These alterations are quite clever in all honesty, because they actively encourage killing the images, and if a group elects to ignore them, they are harshly punished. It's a clear and obvious mechanic that people can go, oh, I need to make sure those things die quickly. And I'm always in favour of obvious mechanics that teach people how something works without a guide. Now, with the exception of Violet Hold, because that place is just dictated by timers and portals and so on, pacing is kind of interesting in these instances, because you have this buff that increases movement speed and ultimately your damage and your healing, but if you pull the pack too many, you will still get swamped with mirror images, and at that point, it's likely healers will then get silenced, which will cause your tank to die, and things will all go to pot. So, as long as you're careful with your pulls, they are in theory quicker in beta than in alpha. But getting a touch overzealous will just result in a repair bill. But yeah, they're not bad. The affix here was iterated upon fairly well, and it shows the reward and punishment aspects of the images quite clearly. And the biggest issue really is just getting over the reputation of the Oculus. Okay, so we're getting close to the end of things now. The Culling of Stratholme. With this one, you've got Plague Rune with a 30% increase to mob damage and 100 to health. Affix here, you don't really notice. Being hit by a mob in the instance has a chance to infect you with the plague, and if it's not dispelled, you'll turn into a zombie. Think of the Wrath pre-patch event. Thing is, you have a minute to dispel it. Yeah, that's not at all dangerous. You need to be physically sat on your own brain to screw this one up. And if you have a shaman in your group, just drop Cleansing Totem and you'll never need to pay attention to the debuff ever again. This doesn't change in Titan Rune Beta. Debuff is still applied the same way and has a minute timer within which you need to dispel. I refer you to my previous comment about shamans. What they have done though is the following. Mob damage goes up by 40% and health by 120. You've also got these huge hulking mega zombie mobs. They aren't overly dangerous per se, but they are the finest example of a damage sponge. They are entirely there to slow a group down and reduce the likelihood of you beating the timer for the infinite boss. However, they also go full-on Monty Python on us and give everyone a single holy hand grenade. This little beauty can pop mega zombies like the unpleasant zits they are. It'll also give everyone in the group a handy little power-up for a little while. The thing here though is that there are more than 5 mega zombies. You've got somewhere in the region of 7 to 10 in the first gauntlet, and 2 in the final gauntlet leading to Mal'Ganis. Now, you don't need to kill them all, but you will want to use the grenades to make your life easier for those that you do kill. The idea here is to utilise this particular tool where you need it most or will gain the most from it. It's a cool idea and gives agency back to the players and does in theory allow an array of tactics and routes to form depending on grenade usage. In alpha mode, this dungeon was undeniably the easiest of the lot, and that's not really changed in beta. I still like going here and generally enjoy it more than a number of other dungeons in all honesty. And I must admit, for the first couple of days at least, whilst people were still figuring things out, my ults did struggle to meet the timer for the infinite boss and even missed it on a couple of occasions. This is less of an issue now that everyone has acclimated to the changes, but it was still interesting to see nevertheless, and is something that will be more common with lesser geared groups. Last but not least, we have Trial of the Champion. The newest 5-man of the lot has the Gladiator Rune empowerment. No alpha mode here, Titan Rune Beta only. Now, I can kinda see where the devs were going with this, but it honestly feels a little bit messy. A Friday afternoon job, if you will. So, standard stuff first, there's 40% increase to mob damage and 120% to HP. So, the affix itself, yeah, a bit all over the place as I said. The spectators are now throwing things into the arena. You've got explosive and frost traps, which operate as the hunter versions do, so you want to avoid them as often as you can. But there are also damage and healing buffs similar to what you get in Battlegrounds, same visuals and everything. There are also flowers, which give you a little damage increase, which can stack, and lastly, you can get smacked on the head with a chair, which will naturally stun you for a second or so. Visually, it all makes sense. You look at it and go, yes, I know what this is, and on your first viewing of the dungeon in beta mode, you may even actively hunt down the buffs. That won't last long though. You'll quickly learn that it is not worth it, and you'll spend most of your time near the gates where the mobs come in, huddled into the wall to avoid the traps and anything else being thrown your way. Because, unless the good buffs spawn right next to you, they are not worth the hassle. If the damage buff spawns on the other side of the arena, and between you and it is a carpet of traps, by the time you get it and get back, the boss is probably very nearly dead, and you've just spent 20 seconds trudging through frost traps or other annoyances when you could have just been stabbing away the entire time. Again, it's hard to miss what they were going for here, but the execution feels somewhat fumbled. They've taken a dungeon with already limited space, as it's literally only one room, and reduced the playable area even further. And what makes this worse is there is even a boss in here that can and will fear you into all of the traps. So unless you have a shaman with Tremor Totem up or someone who can immediately dispel, there is a high chance you will just get screwed over by RNG. Thing is, the dungeon doesn't feel bad per se, and I would still say that the spider dungeons have the worst affix thus far. This just feels really unfinished and not overly thought out. A decent enough idea, just poorly implemented. I mean, they could still keep the traps, but just reduce the amount and have some that interact with players and some that interact with the bosses, so that a group has the incentive to navigate the minefield if it means they can then poison the boss with something that perhaps reduces casting speed or increases the damage they take, for example. You can also keep the flowers and the bananas and the chairs, but allow them to interact with the bosses too. You can drag them to a spotlight to be stunned by a chair to the back of the head, but equally, make sure to avoid the flowers, because that will then buff the boss as well. There is just so much that can be done with this concept. It just feels like they've done the bare minimum to give the dungeon a beta mode, and it's sad to say, it feels really lazy. They could have done more, and perhaps it's wrong of me to expect more. but I do, and I want it better for this dungeon's beta mode. To finish then, something I haven't mentioned yet throughout any of the dungeons is that yes, the loot is much improved from Titan Rune Alpha. Beta dungeons now drop 10-man Ulduar loot and 10-man Nax loot. 10-man Ulduar loot is far more incentivizing than Nax loot ever was, and when you combine that with a daily dungeon and the badges you can get, you can quickly gear up an ult and just crack on. Even if you use your badges to buy the item level 232 tier 9 pieces, it still has the potential to massively increase an ult's power. This is the sort of gearing structure Wrath would go on to be known for in the future. If you just put even the smallest amount of effort into any character, you will always be doing something that can add to your power, and you don't feel utterly trapped by pointless systems that bog you down. Certainly for me, I've enjoyed playing my ults these last weeks because I don't have to meet silly gear score requirements to join the only version of a raid where I can get meaningful upgrades. I can do a couple of dungeons, even target certain instances daily that I know drop a specific upgrade. Whilst I'm doing this, I'm still getting conquest badges which can be spent on Ulduar equivalent items and a bit of tier. I'm also adding to my Triumph badges, and from there I can make the decision whether or not to buy the 232 tier pieces, perhaps save them for when I get a trophy of the Crusade, or maybe even buy a trinket or something like that. You've also got the Sidereal Essences, which you can then use to purchase Ulduar 10 hard mode loot. You get one of these every final boss you kill in a beta dungeon. The acquisition is a bit slower than badges, but the items are generally far more powerful, so it does make sense. But it is good to be able to work towards these bigger, more impactful upgrades at a pace that is tied more to yourself and not overly gated. You can clear the board every day for a guaranteed 13 of these essences, or you can work away at a slower pace, maybe only doing the daily or something. But either way, you're always moving forward. However, all of this is completely pointless if the gameplay tied to getting all of those currencies isn't fun. But Titan Rune Beta, at least right now, is proving to be pretty solid overall, at least in my opinion. Now, there will always be people who put up with the crap to get the upgrades and yada yada, but the vast majority of folk will just avoid something if it's painfully unfun. So the fact we now have a system of 5-man content that is reasonably rewarding for all levels of player and is fun to do is only going to go on to increase the amount of people taking part in that content. And I hope Blizzard can keep improving upon this system long into Classic's future. Because whilst these dungeons are more challenging than standard heroics, they still don't come close to TBC heroics, and I don't expect them to in all honesty. But I hope for all that is good and green that Blizzard can get a few practice swings in on this system before Kata, so we can have some properly challenging and rewarding 5-man content there. But that's all I gotta say for now. I hope you enjoyed, and let me know your own thoughts down below. If you'd be so kind as to like, sub, share with your pals and so on, that'd be grand. The algorithm demands many sacrifices be made. Have a good one, folks. Bye for now.